and good evening if you are tuning in from this part of the world. Good afternoon if you are in the Africas, in Africa or Europe, and good morning if you are tuning in from the Americas. My name is Zishan Salahuddin, and I lead the Center for Regional and Global Connectivity at the Bad Lab. Our firm, just about 2 weeks ago, released a report on China in East Africa and how development financing has changed and morphed there over time, and what this implies for emerging and frontier markets engaged with China, not just in Africa, but in the rest of the world. Wherever you may be streaming from, you can find links to this report in the session notes underneath. Our policy roundtable this evening is going to delve a little bit deeper into this topic, and for this purpose, we have a tremendous roster of experts and voices weighing in on this issue from a wide variety of perspectives and viewpoints. I will quickly introduce them now. First, we have with us Dr. Ammar A. Malik, a senior research scientist at 8Data, where he leads the Chinese Development Finance Program. Ammar is also a non-resident fellow at the Bad Lab. Prior to joining 8Data, Ammar was the director of research at the Research at Evidence for Policy Design, a research initiative at the Harvard Kennedy School. Dr. Malik, from what I've been able to calculate, has won close to $3 million in research grants over the course of his work. That's how tremendous his contribution is to the field. And he holds several affiliations and has a very storied career. I'm sorry, Dr. Ammar, if we keep going, I think we'll take up most of the time for this particular policy roundtable. But thank you very much for joining us and being here. I would also like to introduce Dr. Karen Zhu, who's the Assistant Policy Researcher, a PhD candidate at the Pardee Rand Graduate School. Her research interests include infrastructure development, in emerging markets especially, program evaluation, the Belt and Road Initiative, China's engagement with the world, international development, China-Africa relations, and China-US relations. So I'm very interested, Karen, to get your viewpoint on a lot of the things we're going to be discussing today. Thank you for joining us. We also have Oyen Tarelado Moses, or simply Tarela. Tarela is a data scientist at the Global China Initiative at the Boston University Global Development Policy Center. She has worked on the international relations team of the Export-Import Bank of the United States as a policy analyst. She has also worked at the China-Africa Research Initiative as a research assistant and served as the U.S. Development Finance Corporation. She has researched and analyzed political risks, development finance, and the global export credit market. And I'd be very interested, Tarela, in hearing from you about some of the political risks that China is now very keen on not associating itself with as far as development financing in East Africa is concerned. Thank you very much for joining us. Our fourth guest, who is a little delayed and we're hoping will be with us very shortly, is Mr. Ovigwe Iguigu. He's a policy analyst at Development Reimagined. He specializes in geopolitics with reference to Africa in a very sort of global, very changing global order. His work includes research and providing strategic advice on geoeconomics and security in Asia, which is a topic that's, of course, very near and dear to my heart as well, because China's involvement in Pakistan also rests very much at the intersection of security here. Very prolific individual who has appeared in several national and international media on a variety of subjects related to Africa's development and security. So our topic today, East Africa is growing in strategic and economic importance. There are many frontier markets, including Kenya, Ethiopia, Tanzania, and so on and so forth. The competitive environment in East Africa, its growing population, the socio-economic indicators, the socio-political indicators, make the study that we've put together over at the Bad Lab quite a compelling case for how this applies to the rest of the world. China's growing economic footprint, by one estimate $23 billion invested in the region, is now tempered by ground realities, criticism, some of which is justified, a lot of which is not. The net result is that the relationship between East Africa and Africa at large and China is morphing and changing and is getting increasingly grounded, both in terms of what African leaders are getting out of it and the fact that China does want to reduce its political risk profile in the region. All factors indicate that China is an adaptable development partner, that it's willing to course correct, renegotiate, restructure debt. However, the report does make it clear that it must demonstrate value beyond what some view as sort of throwing money at the problem at the intersection of recipient nations galvanizing around economic imperatives as opposed to political expedience or point scoring. Dr. Ahmad, I think I'll start with you, if that's okay. I think it would be good for our audience to paint a bit of a global picture and context here to sort of understand where all of this is coming from, what major changes have happened, and why is it also that China's international development financing has reduced dramatically between 2010 and 2018, but perhaps with a particular focus on Africa.
Thank you, Zishan, and it's very good to be here today to talk to you a little bit about the work that we've been doing at Data. We have a global purview, so maybe I'll give a few facts about what we are finding in our research, and then drill a little bit down into Africa, as you've suggested. So first of all, through the Global Chinese Development Finance data set that Data has maintained for many years now, our latest release covered 18 years since the turn of the century. And we found that there are around the world over 13,000 Chinese development finance projects, which are official financing around the world. And they touch something like $843 billion worth of commitments. The Africa share of that is about 5,000 or so projects worth a total of $207 billion. And if I were to focus on just the Eastern Africa region, and here I'm talking about the UN's definition of Eastern Africa, which not just includes the big countries like Kenya, Tanzania, and Ethiopia, but also Burundi and Uganda and others. That region has received about $45 billion worth of Chinese official financing, at least since 2017. For something like 750 projects. So you're talking about a really large portfolio of projects by any stretch of imagination. And of course, when you have such a large portfolio, it creates all sorts of different effects in the international development space, as well as the local political economies that this report tackles. A few highlights of the report that Data released last year, and I think are all relevant to this region. First of all, we're finding around the world that China is now outspending the United States in official financing to the tune of 2 to 1 basis, which means that globally China was committing something like $85 billion worth of official financing in the years 2017 and in the Belt and Road era in general, as compared to only 35 to 37 billion from the United States. So that's a huge sea change. But China is not just doing that from traditional aid perspective. What we are finding in our research is actually 90% of these commitments are in the form of loans, or what we call other official financing. A typical loan from China, we find in our data, is around 4.2% with a 10-year repayment period. And that compares to Western donors like Japan, Germany, and others doing it at around 1% and a repayment period of much longer. What we're also finding during the Belt and Road era in general, and this is certainly the case in Eastern Africa, that there has been a massive increase in what we call mega projects. So projects worth $500 or more. We have seen a threefold increase in those projects around the world. We are also seeing that China has become more likely to use syndicated loans to finance these big ticket items. And this is something that was highlighted in the Tabad Lab report as well. We certainly see that when it comes to big loans or export credits, on average, we're talking about syndicated loans of $1.3 billion or more. And a lot of these syndicated loans not just include Chinese state-owned commercial banks and Chinese policy banks and state-owned enterprises, but they also include Western banks like HSBC, Citibank, and others. They have played a massive role into this, which I feel isn't discussed nearly as much. Talking about the state-owned commercial banks, and Zishan, you were talking about a slowdown in commitments. I think we should take that with a pinch of salt. I know that the Tabad Lab report talked about that, but I think we have to look at the context more fully. If you just focus on the two policy bank, China Exim Bank and CDB, certainly it appears that there's been a slowdown in new commitments around the world. But what Data has found is that there's a five-fold increase in the commitments coming out of state-owned commercial banks like ICBC and Bank of China. So what we feel is happening is that there is a changing of strategy strategy within China, a learning that is taking place, both in terms of syndications and also in terms of the greater role that state-owned commercial banks are now playing. And I think we need to pay close attention to this. Also, in the era of COVID, when there has been quite a bit of debt distress around the world, we also need to keep an eye on short-term liquidity, balance of payment lending. We are finding quite a bit of that. We haven't released that data yet, but early indications are, for example, at least in Pakistan and Sri Lanka, we're finding just since 2018, Chinese entities have funded more than $20 billion worth of short-term credit to avert balance of payment crises. And so I think this kind of trend is going to continue and will also play out in Africa. The last thing I'll say that might be relevant to this is that there has been a doubling of the use of repayment safeguards since the launch of the Belt and Road Initiative. By repayment safeguards, I mean what is the guarantees that a lender has to make sure that they get their monies back, which could include things like collateral, it could include a credit insurance, or it could include a third-party guarantee. So we found that since Belt and Road started in 2013, the proportion of Chinese official financing that benefits from one of these three instruments has doubled from 30% up to 60%. So I think those are some of the key highlights that emerge from our global research, and in as the discussion moves forward, I'll be happy to dig a little bit deeper into some of those countries that we're interested in today.
Thank you, Dr. Ahmad. It's always a humbling experience to have you on one of these panels, because the sheer volume of data and insights and information that we glean from it is tremendous. And yes, that's exactly what I meant earlier when I said that the lending profile seems to be slowing down, but I think that's from the perspective of direct sovereign lending, and instead they're now going through financial institutions, which may also, of course, help with the political risk profile. Thorela and Ovigwe, if I may come to you next, development finances we've been discussing is a great way, particularly for wealthy nations to engage with the rest of the world and countries with significant financing gaps. China has previously been accused of sort of creating this, diplomacy/debt trap, which a lot of third-party independent sources have now debunked. The very famous case of which is the Hambantota port in Sri Lanka. And there was a major piece in, I believe it was The Atlantic, that is quoted quite frequently. But the new thing that has sort of emerged, and that Tabad Lab's report on this also speaks about, is this whole idea of monopolizing the whole industry chain export, which includes everything from feasibility studies to environmental studies to project design, post-completion maintenance, operation running, financing and structuring, all of those things. Now, China is very much a monolith under the one-party system, and I think most outside of China don't really quite understand that. My question to the two of you, and Thorela, I'll come to you first, and then Ovigwe, is how valid is this concern of the whole industry chain export monopolization? Is it actually beneficial to have sort of a one-window operation? Is it detrimental? And what effect does it have on development financing in the region and the associated sovereign political risk?
Thank you for that question, Zishan. And I think we should start answering this question from the perspective of who the actors are on the Chinese side that are, one, extending this financing, but also involved in projects in East Africa. So I really appreciated how Dr. Amar laid out the institutions that are involved. And I think it's important to note that primarily, the two large institutions that have provided finance to the region are the Export-Import Bank of China and China Development Bank, who have effectively kind of functioned as export credit agencies. And what are export credit agencies? These are financing institutions that seek to support the domestic economy by supporting the internationalization of companies outside of the domestic country itself. And so these institutions have mandates to, in a sense, support their own companies. And if you look at the Export-Import Bank of China's mandate, they focus on promoting steady economic growth, structural adjustment, supporting foreign trade, and implementing the Going Global strategy, right? So what does this mean in terms of how it looks like in practice on the ground? This means that it's more likely that when China is coming through their companies and also providing the financing packages, it's more easier for them to provide a full package that not only includes the contractor, but includes the finance and includes any other kind of institutions that can provide other aspects of completing the project, such as a feasibility study. And that is attractive to a borrower where it becomes a one-stop shop, right, for being able to address your development project. But I think the issue then becomes for the host country is to what extent are these institutions serving not only the project, but also the requirements and the goals of the host country itself. So I think it is important for the host country, especially in East Africa and all across the world, as they're assessing different financing packages, to check on all aspects of the project and negotiate to the extent that the financing package, in addition to all the other institutions are involved, are serving kind of the needs of the project and the goals of the country itself.
And Ovigwe, same question to you.
Yeah, very very good point by Terala. I think one of the other important thing to add is, see, if you look at many African countries when it comes to building these large scale infrastructure projects, right? If the experience so far, of course, has been if you can do the engineering, procurement, and construction, it not only streamlines the paperwork in many ways, but also makes it just seems generally more efficient. And rather than juggling several contractors and experts and all of that. So from an efficiency standpoint, the complete package really works. It does make things easier for for countries or recipient countries or countries who are working towards getting their infrastructure built. However, one of the challenge, not necessarily challenge, or one of the concerns on the ground is you also have in for example in the Nigerian market several other construction companies who are vying for projects. Sometimes even local construction companies are also trying to get into construction as well, and they make very good case for if they cannot get access to construction, then when it comes to maintenance, they probably would be out out of even consideration. And even if they are providing, they are going to provide these services at a cheaper cost in terms of maintenance now, which is really where many domestic construction companies are actually at odds with government. They will tell you, yes, of course, now we can do the maintenance, but if we're not in on the construction, that is problematic for us. That's one. And then two, they also make the argument that we can do it for cheaper because then you have to pay us in local currency, and that reduces pressure on foreign exchange. But it's I think governments most times have to play this balancing act between trying to reconcile the ease and efficiency of the full package, but also trying to ensure that they're able to get lots of their domestic firms into the game. But again, there's also the question of technology transfer as well. So it's another reason why in many instances, where there is no like inclusion of or opportunities given to domestic construction companies, there is a lot of disappointment, and you find that a lot in the media, whereby a project is underway, is being constructed, and then some reports come of how we're not seeing enough of local talents being used in the construction project. And then that how do you expect to build and maintain this project going into the future? I think a very recent example was when we had we had a terrorist attack on a railway in Nigeria, for instance. The Chinese built railway between Abuja and Kaduna. Even till date, the railways, that axis has been closed, and this is getting to 3 months now. So some time ago, I remember even participating in an event where this case was built as an example, as if we had the expertise ready and the experience with local firms, maybe by now, the cat or the railway line will back operating. So there are issues, but I think these issues can be resolved if we do more of like blended action or blended contract or approaches to this construction, not necessarily looking at the overall efficiency of the EPCs or those type of full packages that we've seen so far.
Absolutely. Thank you, Wigwe. And the other thing that you mentioned, I think we'll come back to the security angle of this in just a little bit, especially given your background and expertise in it and the fact that you've spoken and written so much about it. Karen, I want to zoom out just a little bit and specifically speak about this growing global competition. The West has now announced the B3W. At last count, if I remember the number correctly, it was 600 billion committed to it. The B3W is obviously designed as a direct competitor to the BRI. And this implies several things. It implies that Chinese economic initiatives around the world are working in some capacity. It's a source of angst for the West. This is further underlined by the fact that China has been declared as the most existential crisis for the US, and other smaller aspects of this, such as the formation of the CMC under the CIA. My question to you is, what effect will China's engagement in East Africa, and largely the African continent, have on the global order, on the increasingly deteriorating US-China relations, and on Africa itself?
Thank you very much for the question. So I think it's not necessarily, to begin with, talking about the contrast between the Belt and Road Initiative and the PGII or the B3W, which was evolved from the B3W. So although right now in the short run, we don't see lots of likelihood of the two working together. I think in the long run, they actually may not be necessarily completely at odds with each other, because right now, as we see the B3W, which is Build Back Better World, and which has been evolved into a partnership for global infrastructure investment, PGII. So as it evolves from a statement of intent to more concrete plans, I think there are still some space for China and US to work together and to identify some common grounds, although not in the very near future. So the reason why I think this is the case is because there are some inherent complementarity in terms of their sectoral focus and financing mechanisms. So we can take China's role in East Africa as an example. So China's role in implementing the Belt and Road Initiative and in delivering development finance in East Africa region primarily focuses on hard infrastructure. For example, ports, roads, dams, railways, electric power plants, and telecommunication facilities. So these are actually built on China's long-term rich experience in physical infrastructure development domestically. And so in comparison, PGII or other Western-led infrastructure initiatives tend to focus on softer outcomes. For example, engaging with issues related to climate change, health and health security, modernizing digital technology, gender equity, and enhancing the equity and access for vulnerable population. So I think in these domains, the two, meaning BRI and PGII or B3W, are not necessarily at odds. So there are some there is a level of complementarity between the two. And also the two are complementary in terms of their financing mechanism. The Belt and Road or Chinese Development Finance, as it stands right now, largely still relies on bilateral loans and it's like also largely in like relies on investment backed by state-owned banks and funds to support project construction in developing countries. And right now, there's relatively still limited success in leveraging the private capital market. B3W and PGII in its statements actually plans to mobilize bilateral and multilateral tools, and as well as the private sector to catalyze billions of dollars of investment. So I think from this perspective, in terms of financial mechanism, the two are also complementary. And in terms of the two, how the two may work together, right now we can see actually the BRI is actually going through a period of reflection, reassessment, and recalibration. So we see China's development finance and infrastructure finance scaling back, and that actually shows some trends of adjustments. So from these perspectives, I think there is an opportunity for the US and China to, if not work together, to complement each other in this development finance and infrastructure development space. And this also applies to East Africa.
Of course. Thank you very much, Karen. I think these are exceptionally important points, but I do think that there is something to be said about there being an opportunity and there being the possibility of complementarity versus where things are headed in terms of geopolitics at the moment. I also wonder, and I will ask this of some of my other panelists a little bit later, I also wonder if what's happening within East Africa in terms of African leaders trying to capitalize on this money coming in, and we've seen this happen quite a bit, especially around election seasons, whether or not that's the same kind of sort of approach that the Western initiative would also take, in that will it actually add value or will it be used mostly as an electioneering or political expedience tool to sort of score points or whatever you want to call it. We'll come to that a little bit later. Ovigwe, security for Chinese projects is a key concern in every part of the world. Here in Pakistan, for example, security has been a challenge, and non-state actors and extremist elements have unoccasionally targeted Chinese interests, and that's always been a source of concern and sometimes, frankly speaking, embarrassment for us. What are some of the security challenges in Africa for China and its concerns outside of the usual suspects? How can some of these be mitigated? And can any of these actors be exploited as proxies? And how does all of this translate to China's security concerns around the world?
Yeah, when it comes to security, I think generally the patterns are very similar to what you have even in West Asia that you mentioned. So, for instance, very recently we had a case of kidnapping of Chinese experts who are working in Zenguru. It's a hydropower project just south of Abuja. Here, a state called Niger State, right? And that also happened just few weeks or thereabout after the attack on the Chinese built finance railway that I earlier mentioned. So if you look at what we're having to deal with here is, on one hand, we're trying to make the case that yes, credit rating agencies are actually biased, and in many ways they are, in terms of when they ascribe risk premiums to African countries. But on the other hand, you have real issues that make it very difficult to make that the case against credit rating agencies. So, for instance, what I just mentioned about kidnapping and also terrorist attack against infrastructure. I think you have that in Pakistan as well, in Balochistan. Yeah. So these are real problems for the government, and also problems for investors as well. But if we move away from a project basis to even looking at the broad landscape, well, it is very important to understand that development in itself is actually a tool to overcoming security challenges. In the sense that if you look at Africa's demographics and just the sheer amount of unemployment and youth unemployment and the youth bulge that is often referred to as Africa's demographic boom. Well, without jobs, the boom can very easily become a doom. So we really have to create an enabling environment to continue to be able to attract these investments into our countries, because those investments create the jobs that in to a large extent help overcome criminality and driven by unemployment and frustration. So that is a very important point. Secondly, there is also an approach in terms of how we're trying to solve this problem during partnerships. So, for instance, very recently we saw at FOCAC, we got the promise that there was going to be an appointment of a Chinese Horn of Africa envoy for peace and security, and that was followed through. And then around June this year, there was the peace conference in Horn of Africa that was very well attended, and all of the heads of state and very supportive of trying to resolve the issues in East Africa, like the conflict in northern Ethiopia and Tigray region, and also some other issues with regards to that also I think will play into that in the future, whether we're looking at the Ethiopia's conflict with Egypt over the Nile and the dam it's building. So there are risks, right? That there's no denying that. But if you look at the sheer scale of project across the continent, right? So Nigeria is one example, and yes, we have issues of kidnapping in other parts of the continent as well, but the scale of project, the size of project, the amount of Chinese experts working on the continent, I think it's still very, very limited, or it's not up to threshold to say there should be a reassessment of risk, or to give justification for maybe cutting down investments, or trying to limit investment to certain areas that doesn't require experts going into certain countries. And for me, I think that's a very important point to underscore, because like I earlier mentioned, part of solving the issues of security and risk is actually doubling down on development.
Thank you, Obigwe. That's a very relevant point, and there's a larger point here that can be made about military presence in the region, as well as whether or not this could potentially become sort of a staging ground for major powers in the world to sort of flex their military might and muscle. We'll come back to that point a little bit later. Ahmad, I want to come back to you for just a bit, if you will allow me. One of the conversations we had before this roundtable occurred was the intersection of the report that the Bad Lab has released and how it juxtaposes against the tremendous data that you and your team have put together over at AData, how all of that sort of intersects, and what are some of the more interesting data points that you've been able to uncover that audiences and other members of this particular panel might benefit from.
Thank you, Zishan. I think this report is a good contribution in that it brings together quite a number of issues in a coherent way, and I think helps us enhance our understanding of China's involvement in East Africa. I just wanted to say, we have found that there are over 750 projects in East Africa that the Chinese official financing has enabled over the years, that they are to the tune of $45 billion. Ethiopia, obviously not surprisingly to this panel and our audience, comes up both in the top 10 global list of ODA or aid recipients and OOF or loan recipients. They have received 16 billion out of this 45 billion. Kenya is around 10 billion, DRC around 8 billion. And then there are a number of smaller players where Somalia, for example, has only received, according to our data, less than $50 million. Rwanda is less than $500 million, and same for Madagascar. So there's a mix of Chinese interests within the region. I think that one or two important points that the report makes, I think, are first of all, it says that the most of the engagements that the Chinese are doing are bilateral. They're less interested in multilateral engagements. So I think that's correct. But what we are finding, as I mentioned earlier, is there is a lot of syndication that's taking place. So they may not be participating in as large projects in the multilateral system or the Western-led multilateral system. But if you were to think about risk diversification, I think there is a clear evidence of course correction or self-correction. As Karen was saying, that there is now a recalibration taking place in Beijing about some of this, especially as more of these projects become due for payments. The repayment periods are now due, and so a lot of countries are having trouble paying back their loans, and COVID doesn't help with that. I also think there is very clear evidence that there is a system within China that takes in this feedback and makes course correction. I think that is tremendously helpful. But the other thing which I'm finding, I think, is equally true for East Africa as it is for South Asia, where I keep a close eye on, is the point that the report makes around countries themselves having their own mechanisms or technical capacities to do their own self-evaluation on how they will be able to afford these projects, what will be economically feasible, what terms and conditions do they need to receive, and so on. I think there is, in this era of great power competition and a lot of this discussion around US and China, I think we forget that real beneficiaries of these projects ought to be people in regions like East Africa. And I think governments in the global South need to really step up their game and enhance their own understanding, both technical understanding, but also political, economic understanding of issues. And if I may add, Zishan, I think you mentioned something about Hambantota and the myth around that. I think an interesting case that we highlighted in a recent policy brief was the Uganda Entebbe Airport. Let me briefly explain what happened there. There was a story that came out in British media and then was picked up by Trevor Noah in the Daily Show as a comedy skit, basically showing China Exim Bank or Chinese creditors showing up in Uganda and trying to seize the Entebbe airport because the Ugandan government was having trouble repaying it. What we actually found that there is, data went ahead and found the original loan agreement between the Ugandan Civil Aviation Authority and China Exim Bank, and we found absolutely no provision legally for Chinese creditors to go and grab that airport. And in any case, I think they're savvier than that. They don't want an illiquid asset that they'll have to go and liquidate. They want something which is more current, and it's like a grab and go asset that you can put in your backpack and walk out the front door, so to speak. And the way that they've done it is that they've put this minimum cash balance requirement in a lot of these loans. In the Entebbe case, we found that there is now a lender-controlled bank account arrangement where the revenues from the airport will go to that account, and once the payments are taken off, then the rest of the money will remain. So I think there are fundamental misunderstandings in the way in which these projects are designed, and I would say people should check out the original loan agreements. We've published around 100 of them around the world in a report called How China Lends. It's on ADA's website. And certainly, I think the Entebbe airport case makes a clear point that that there is no such thing as a sort of a coercion or a debt trap, that it was set on purpose, certainly to grab it. It's just that the Ugandans were dealing with a very savvy lender and who was very interested in protecting their interests and also getting paid with interest, which is how capitalism works at the end of the day.
That is, in fact, how capitalism works at the end of the day, very much indeed. We have spoken, thank you, Amar, we've spoken quite a bit about China's period of reflecting, and I think that's a point that Karen also made, and sort of the change in modalities of lending, from going from direct sovereign lending to going through banks and such. Tarela, if I may ask you, since you have worked quite a bit on international relations, and specifically as a policy analyst at the Export-Import Bank of the United States, I'm very interested in what you have to say about, we've spoken about how the Chinese thinking has evolved, but how has the African nations' leaders' thinking evolved over the course of the same time? And whether or not they are more in tune with, whether or not this kind of development financing is feasible, sustainable, if this is something that they want to invest in long term, and how does this affect their overall goals for providing economic security and viability to their nations?
Thank you again for the question. Again, I think it's important to kind of break down the decision makers when it comes to how the focus on development finance has changed over time from the African perspective. So oftentimes when it comes to decision making about financing from Africa, there's a lot of talk of African agency, especially more recently. And I think it's important for us to remember that African agency has multiple agents, and a lot of these agents have different kind of roles and functions and goals in making the decision to accept development finance or not. So in one sense, Chinese financing is a function of supply itself, but I think it also has been responding to demand from African countries. And when this demand is for meeting things like infrastructure gaps and access to more power, it's often the political leaders that are at the forefront of decision making. However, there are other actors, like I mentioned earlier, agents that have the ability to influence this decision making. So I think over time, we have seen these actors play more of a role, especially in countries that have political regimes that allow for more discussion around these projects. So if we're thinking about the actors, I mentioned political leaders who in effect are the decision makers, especially when it is a sovereign to sovereign lending decision to be made. But we also have contractors that are local contractors and Chinese contractors that are beneficiaries of the ultimate decision to choose Chinese financing. But we also have NGOs and civil society who care about things like the environment, the social effects of a project, displacement even of individuals. Then we also have the public who are influencers themselves and speak through things such as the media, and I would include maybe journalists in that civil society kind of category / public category. And I think we have seen over time that the public has been asking more questions, particularly in places like Kenya, about these projects and asking more for transparency and an openness. So recently, there have been many calls been made from the media and the public in Kenya to release and make transparent the Kenyan standard gauge railway contract. And I think these kind of recent developments has an ability to influence policymakers in how they make the decision to choose financing, but it also has an ability for agents to kind of fight it out within themselves to make sure that the best package is being chosen for the development project. So just to answer your question and summarize in short, I think over time, as the media has covered these projects, there has been more of an influence we see from the public to kind of shape how the decision is made to receive Chinese development financing or even services for development projects within their own countries.
Thank you, Tarmela. There's Azan going on next door, so you might hear that in the background. I want to quickly ask Dr. Zhu, as someone who engages in program evaluation, what is your assessment of China's role in investment in Africa so far? Some of the other panelists have weighed in on that. The question that I asked you earlier was about, the two competing powers. A period of reflection and sort of course correction is all well and good, but are there any critical areas of concern that may be missing from the discourse that you think should be highlighted?
Thank you. I think that's a great question. So I've been working on program evaluation for 5 years. That's my dissertation topic for my doctoral dissertation. And so I think right now there are growing number of literature on the Belt and Road Initiative and China's global engagement, as well as China's infrastructure finance. And I think a lot of the discussion right now actually focus on the process or just the stakeholder dynamics, and also just some speculations about some potential outcomes. What's really missing from this picture is actually on the ground analysis of what's actually going on with these projects. What are the actual project outcomes now that the projects have been implemented, constructed, and operated? And what are some opportunities for the local people, and what are some challenges at hand? I think part of the reason why these issues are extremely difficult to be captured is because, first of all, on the ground access these days, particularly accessing different groups of stakeholders, is getting increasingly difficult, particularly with Chinese projects, where with the heightened tension between US and China, and for example, the growing difficulty for US-based and Europe-based researchers to access Chinese stakeholders that are involved in these projects. And there's another reason for the difficulty in capturing the impact of these projects is because these projects are simply one of its kind in these countries, and they are of such a large scale that traditional evaluation methodologies are not readily applicable, because these available methodologies typically deal with projects of a time span of about 10 years. However, if you're looking at infrastructure projects, particularly mega infrastructure projects, that's taking a large proportion of Belt and Road investment, these projects are of such a large scale that, and there are of so many different domains of impact, and their impacts go beyond the 10-year period that's like can be captured by a program evaluation framework. And that's why, despite all these speculations about what Chinese projects are doing on the ground, there are actually very limited literature on actual assessment of project impact. And I think this is also an area where the Chinese government and the host country government can work together. In my research, I actually tried to assess the socioeconomic impact of the Kenyan Standard Gauge Railway project. What I found in this process is that data availability is a constant challenge for me. So if the host country government and the Kenyan and the Chinese government can work together in enhancing the data availability for these projects, and as Terella has mentioned, enhancing the transparency related to different domains, different aspects of these projects, that would be extremely helpful. And I think just establishing a longitudinal tracking mechanism for understanding project outcomes and impacts, and creating a feedback loop that actually feeds these assessments into future decision-making, project planning, would be something that's critical for both the host country as well as for sustainable development of the Belt and Road Initiative.
Thank you, Karen. I completely agree. I think those are very valid points that should be part of the consideration, and certainly part of the discourse as a lot of these evaluations are made. Owigwe, we spoke about security earlier. One of the things that I wanted to ask you is preceding geoeconomics is geopolitics and the military competition that exists around the world. Owigwe, are you able to hear me? Sorry. I think we lost you for just a second.
Yeah, I just reconnected now.
Sure. I was just saying that preceding geoeconomics, of course, is geopolitics and sort of this military competition around the world. Djibouti, from what I understand, was the plan's first foreign military base as well. Do you see the military muscle flexing sort of becoming a more pronounced issue in the region, especially as time goes on and these competing powers engage in the region with their own massive international development programs? And what implications does this have for Africa and for the wider region?
So one of the most important things that I think we really need to understand with China-Africa relations now is we're now at a point where politics and security is getting even as much, even if not more important than the economics of it. And that is not inherently because of the relationship itself, but because of the global context within which the relationship it's developing. And when the PLA Navy opened the base in Djibouti, that was seen as that was projected as one of many to come. But to a large extent, the fact that Djibouti itself is in many ways like some have described it as a military hotel. You have so many military bases in Djibouti, so you cannot necessarily say that is a project for power projection, but more about logistics and supply chains, security, which at the end of the day, every day benefits everyone. You have the Italians have a base, the Japanese, the Americans, and so on and so forth, right? But we cannot deny the fact that there is there are many issues that are coming up in international affairs now that will necessitate China's global security initiative, for instance, is one of those initiatives that has been discussed and been developed in partnership with partner countries all over the world that are signing on. But I also think it's also important to underscore that the competition cannot be divorced from that global security initiative. That's one. And whether the Chinese Navy or military is going to expand globally, I think it's going to be within that framework of global security initiative. And that is why that initiative is meant to give like a framework for what that relationship is going to be like. Let's take, for example, not very long ago, we saw that Solomon Island did, sign an agreement with China, for instance. And then on the 24th, I think that was even yesterday, I don't know if anyone here saw, but Seawave magazine was reporting that the Solomon Islands actually denied entry of, a UK ship, HMS Pay, and then a US Coast Guard, Oliver Henry, to deny entry of those two vessels into its waters. And very immediately, everybody was pointing to the fact that it is because China and Solomon Island has that security arrangement that this is occurring. But we need to, and then of course they're making the same connections to Sri Lanka, and then say, okay, countries who have investment in naval investment or even security investment with China, sorry, maritime investment rather, with China to build ports, they might be in a position where they would sort of be to where they have to make this type of rejections to one side because they have investment from the other side. But I don't think that's a very good argument, in the sense that if a country has a security partnership with another country, and if you look at the fact that the principle under which the GSI, that's the Global Security Initiative that China is putting forward, if you look at the principle of indivisible security and that is very much at the core, I think those concerns need to be taken with a pinch of salt. And if you look at, for instance, with Africa, so not last year we saw that reports from the US media that Equatorial Guinea wants to host a naval base, but that doesn't materialize. But even if they do, there are real domestic reasons, or at least regional reasons, for those kind of security partnerships. We have in West Africa, for instance, a problem of piracy. It is improving now, but in many ways, we could use a lot of support to solve from China, or just about anybody, because we have partnership with the Norwegians, with the Dutch as well, to actually to solve this problem. So we shouldn't get too carried away by the global context when we're trying to discuss the issue of security and security partnership with China. Most especially now that there's also a framework emerging, and the GSI SME. So African countries themselves now have an opportunity to shape that security initiative in a way that they are able to both, protect their national security, strengthen their partnership for their own national security, and ensure that they don't play into any sort of big game that they don't have the total understanding or leverage over the dynamics.
Understood. Thank you, Wigwe. I was relying on your background and expertise in security in the region to be able to provide that tremendous analysis. I'm very grateful to you because I think those are very, very important points and considerations that perhaps as an outsider it's difficult to sort of put our fingers on. We have about 7 to 8 minutes here. My penultimate question is both to Amar and Tarela, and just brief responses if you can, please. And I asked this question as sort of a very envious Pakistani. The question is about how do you see the future of BRI, especially in the African continent and at large? The Chinese have a very long memory. They have tremendous patience. While we here are trying to survive on a month-to-month basis, dependent entirely on meager tranches of money from multilateral institutions, here's a country that is planning out the next 20, 30, 50, 100 years of how it needs to be and wants to be seen around the world. So where do you see the future of BRI in the region and largely across the world? Amar, you first, and then Tarela.
I definitely think that this is an important moment in the evolution of the Belt and Road. I think the COVID induced financial crisis in many countries is going to bear this out. I think that the many of the infrastructure projects will ultimately have to be refinanced or restructured. I think many projects will fail to generate the economic returns that they had promised. So the million-dollar question is, when this starts to happen, as it is happening, how will Chinese state-owned banks, commercial policy banks and others, how will they react? What will be their response? Will they take a haircut? What kind of solutions will they come up with? Or will they just reschedule the debt, giving these countries some temporary relief? Because the problem is that so far China's approach has been that they feel that these countries have a liquidity crisis, so giving them more loans to deal with that immediate liquidity crisis will help them in the long term. But the assumption here is that these countries are indeed solvent, and it is yet to be seen whether or not they're solvent. I think that is going to be a really important thing. And for countries in the developing world, I think they need to understand that they should not burn bridges with one or the other power as they face these competitions. And then there might be margin for them to work both with China and the US and Western allies on different sectors and different aspects of their development trajectories, because it's very obvious that they need all the help and investment that they can get from anywhere.
And to add to that, I think Amar brought up a good point that has been echoed many times, that this is a kind of rethinking, reflect period for the BRI. And I think in that process, we will see a greater diversification of financing. So I don't think development finance is gone. I think it is definitely here to stay, but we may see other types of financing, such as foreign direct investment from Chinese companies, equity finance, credit lines specifically to regional institutions. And this is exemplified by the FOCAC kind of commitments that were made in the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation that mentioned out of the 40 billion that was committed, there was credit for African regional institutions, SDRs. There was a focus on supporting African exports and providing trade finance specifically for that. So I think we'll see that across other regions as well. And then the second thing I wanted to mention is the greening of the BRI. I think there will be more focus on energy investments and even a shifting of financing for fossil fuel heavy kind of energy sectors to more clean energy sectors, especially in a response to demand. And so I think it will take some time to see what host countries want, but it seems that as China is kind of sitting back and reassessing, they will come back with even stronger kind of financing instruments and institutions that can respond to demand.
Thank you, Tarela. And then finally, my last question will go to Karen, then Owigwe, then Tarela, and then as I began this conversation with Amar, I think it's only appropriate, Amar, that I finish with you. And that question, of course, is just about a minute or two each to provide these quick lessons learned from China's engagement in Africa for the rest of the world, particularly in terms of engaging with China.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think the key takeaway here, I'd like to summarize it in from two perspectives. The first one is that we need to take a multi-stakeholder perspective in understanding China's engagement in Africa and China's engagement in the Belt and Road Initiative. Oftentimes, China's engagement is captured as a one-way street, but it's not. It's at least two-way. And as Tarela has mentioned, the complexity of stakeholder dynamics in this process, there are many stakeholders that are involved in this process. So I think it's better to capture or conceive China's engagement in East Africa and the global South at large as a process of adapting and gradually reconciling different interests that are at play and seeing how these interests gets addressed in this process and through a multi-stakeholder approach would be the way I think that we should take the perspective that we should take. And another perspective that I would recommend us considering more is actually a longer time horizon perspective. Right now, we focus a lot on what's going on with Chinese investment, with the BRI, its status quo. Given the large scale of these projects, a lot of the impacts and outcomes won't be seen in, say, decades. So I think while we are zooming in onto some of the burning issues at the moment, it's also nice to actually take a step back and look at some of the longitudinal impacts and think about what are some broader impacts and influences that Chinese investment could have in this region.
For me, I think the easily the most important lesson is the fact that development without infrastructure is a pipe dream, right? And in fact, today we are seeing the PGI and even Europe's global gateway. To a large extent, is actually validation of China's approach to development, which is very heavy on infrastructure development. If you do not have the infrastructure, harbors, railways, or airports, and all of these major assets actually create trade corridors, you can't talk about industrialization or even energy, for instance. You just cannot, because what are you going to build it on? Or even if you, for some magical reason, are able to produce goods, how are you going to transport it? So for many years before we saw the BRI, there was so much, I wouldn't say experimentation, but a lot of concretized mindset as to the approach to take to development. But with the BRI and even all of China's approach that really centers or that really focuses a lot on infrastructure development, I think the result is very clear. Yes, it's not perfect, but it is working, it is improving, and there's room for more improvement. And like Karen just said, if we take a longitudinal approach to it and look at what this infrastructure development really means on the ground for people and lives and livelihoods, then you can't even begin to calculate the costs. I know it's under a minute, but I actually have like an example. When I was in university, I was in Nigeria's biggest city after I finished university, rather, Lagos. An 11-kilometer bridge, you would spend sometimes up to 3.5 hours to 4 hours to pass an 11-kilometer bridge just because of traffic congestion when you are going to work. It's ridiculous for countries to be experiencing that in this day and age. So we cannot take away the importance of infrastructure development when we're talking about development and just overall life satisfaction, people and publics.
I think for me, the big takeaway in understanding China's model is this idea that Chinese financing institutions work in this coordinated credit space, which means multiple institutions are kind of coming together to provide a blended financing packages of non-concessional, concessional financing, aid, and even commercial financing as well. And these institutions worked in concert with the Chinese public institutions themselves. So I think this understanding of this coordination that appears, at least on the surface, is really important for host countries. I think the second thing I would also highlight is it's important to use the experience host countries have had with Chinese finance to apply it to then other initiatives such as the PGII and even the EU's Global Gateway as well, for ways in which to, one, negotiate for projects that keep into account, including technology transfer, including the participation of local suppliers, and that also address any environmental or social concerns as well. I think it's such a good time of opportunity for a lot of host countries in that you have the BRI, you have the PGI, you have the Global Gateway. But now more than ever, it's very important to remember that this choice, there's power in the fact that there are so many choices, and I think countries can leverage the number of financing packages that will come from all these initiatives to negotiate the best deal for them. So that's the thing I'd like to highlight. Thank you.
And what I would add is that, building off of what was said earlier, definitely these countries need infrastructure, but the way in which they do this should be driven by developing countries themselves based on their own priorities, and they should all spend a little bit of time reflecting on how things went with their engagements with Western donors on the sort of the software side of development, but also on the hardware side with Chinese and other financiers. What were some of the things that they went well? How did they mitigate those risks, and how can they build their own priorities first before going around and shopping for financing? Because often what ends up happening is that just because another country did a project, there is a need for me to do the same thing, not fully internalizing first and foremost whether that is even desirable or feasible in that context, given what we've just discussed about debt and other risks that come with large-scale infrastructure financing.
Thank you, Ahmad. I thought that I knew a good deal about this subject, but I now very much stand humbled and corrected. My very sincere thanks to this very august gathering for sparing their time, for providing their perspective, and for adding such tremendous value to this roundtable and this discussion. Dr. Ammar Malik, Dr. Karen Zhu, Tarela Moses, and Oigbe Iguigu. Thank you so much for joining us and for taking out the time from your very busy schedules. With that, I would like to also thank our audience for engaging, for being a part of this. My name is Zishan Salahuddin, and this has been another Tabadla Policy Roundtable. We will see you on the next one. Goodbye, and Allah Hafiz.